My hands started shaking every time I sat down to write an email to my old boss. Not out of anger. Not even nervousness I could name. Just shaking. And I had no idea why, because I told myself I was completely fine with everything that happened. I want to explain how I found out that wasn't true. For most of my adult life, I considered myself a calm person. Not calm because nothing bothered me, but calm because I was good at moving past things quickly. Someone would say something hurtful, and I'd shrug it off within an hour. A relationship would end, and I'd already be planning next month before the breakup dust settled. I used to think this was a strength. Efficiency of emotion, I called it. Other people dwelled. I processed and moved on. I worked in logistics for a mid-sized shipping company, the kind of job where your day is full of decisions that matter to no one outside the building. Routes, schedules, vendor calls. It was fine. Not exciting, but fine. My manager, a woman named Denise, had a way of correcting people in meetings that made you feel 2 inches tall, but I never let it get to me. At least, that's what I told myself and told my coworkers when they asked how I stayed so unbothered. The truth is, I wasn't unbothered. I was just quick to bury things. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it. It started small. A tightness in my jaw during certain meetings. A stomach that would knot up on Sunday nights, hours before I even opened my laptop for the week. I chalked it up to normal work stress, the kind everyone deals with. I didn't connect it to anything specific. Why would I? In my mind, I had already resolved every conflict that mattered. I didn't hold grudges. I didn't replay arguments in my head. I was, by my own definition, over it. Then came the physical stuff that was harder to explain away. I started getting headaches that showed up at exactly 4 p.m., almost every single day, regardless of how the day had gone. My doctor ran blood work, checked my eyes, asked about my sleep. Everything came back normal. She asked, almost as an afterthought, if anything stressful had happened at that time of day before. I said no. I genuinely believed that. It wasn't until months later, sitting in a waiting room for an unrelated appointment, that something shifted. I overheard a woman on the phone say the words, "I just don't want to deal with him right now," and something in my chest tightened so fast it startled me. I didn't know her. I didn't know who him was. But the sentence hit something in me, and for the first time, I got curious about my own reaction instead of just dismissing it. I started paying attention to my body instead of my thoughts. That was the shift. Not asking myself, am I upset about this, because I always answered no. Instead, I started noticing when my shoulders crept up toward my ears, when my breathing got shallow, when my hands went cold for no clear reason. And what I found unsettled me. Almost every uncomfortable physical symptom traced back to the same period, roughly 2 years earlier, when I'd been let go from a previous job. Not fired for performance. Let go during a round of cuts, the kind where they tell you it's not personal, while security walks you to your car. At the time, I handled it, or so I thought. I updated my resume that same week. I told friends I wasn't upset, that these things happen, that I understood business decisions. I moved on so fast that people complimented my resilience. But my body had never agreed to move on. It had just been waiting for me to notice. The 4 p.m. headaches lined up almost exactly with the time I used to get called into that manager's office for updates, back at the old job. My jaw tightened in meetings because Denise's tone echoed the same clipped, dismissive rhythm my old manager used right before delivering bad news. My hands shook writing emails because somewhere in my nervous system, emails to authority figures had become associated with losing something important. None of this had anything to do with logic. I knew, rationally, that Denise was not my old manager, that this job was not that job, that nothing bad was actually happening right now. But my body wasn't listening to logic. It was responding to pattern. And it had been responding this way for 2 years while I congratulated myself for not dwelling on it. This was the moment that changed how I saw myself. I had spent years believing that moving on quickly meant I was emotionally strong. What I was actually doing was skipping a step. I was suppressing instead of processing, and I had mistaken the absence of visible upset for the absence of impact. The pain didn't disappear just because I refused to look at it. It just changed forms. It stopped being a thought I could argue with and became a physical reaction I couldn't explain, which in some ways is much harder to deal with. Because you can't reason with a headache the way you can reason with a memory. I started reading about this, cautiously, not wanting to turn myself into a diagnosis. What I found matched what I was experiencing closely enough to be uncomfortable. Unprocessed emotional experiences don't just vanish because we've decided we're done with them. They get stored somewhere, and the body has its own way of keeping score, long after the mind has convinced itself the account is closed. I thought about how many times I'd praised myself, or been praised by others, for handling things well, when really I had just been skilled at avoidance. I thought about all the people I knew who prided themselves the same way, the ones who bounced back from breakups in days, who never seemed rattled by layoffs or losses, who other people admired for their composure. I started wondering how many of them had a version of my 4 p.m. headache. Some quiet, physical tax being paid for a debt they didn't know they owed. What changed for me wasn't a single dramatic breakthrough. It was slower than that. I started actually sitting with the discomfort instead of rushing past it. When my jaw tightened in a meeting, instead of ignoring it, I asked myself what it reminded me of. When my stomach knotted on a Sunday night, I let myself actually think about the job loss instead of redirecting my thoughts to something more comfortable. It felt strange at first, almost indulgent, like I was giving myself permission to be upset about something I'd already declared finished. But something interesting happened. The headaches became less frequent. Not gone overnight, but less consistent, less tied to that exact hour. My hands stopped shaking during emails, gradually, without me forcing them to. It wasn't magic. It was just my nervous system finally getting the acknowledgement it had been asking for the entire time, in the only language it had available to it, since I wasn't listening to the quieter signals. I don't think I'm unique in this. I think a lot of us walk around with old reactions living in our bodies, responding to present situations as if they were past ones, and we call it stress, or anxiety, or bad luck with headaches, without ever asking what the pattern is actually pointing to. We assume that if we're not consciously thinking about something, it's no longer affecting us. But the mind and the body don't always agree on when something is over. I still work in logistics. Denise is still Denise. But I don't dread 4 p.m. the way I used to, and my hands are steady when I write difficult emails now. Not because the situation changed, but because I finally stopped asking my mind for answers it didn't have, and started listening to what my body had been trying to tell me the entire time. I wonder sometimes how many people are carrying something similar right now. Some ache, some tension, some small daily discomfort they've never connected to anything, because the mind moved on long before the body was ready to. Maybe the real question isn't what you've forgotten. Maybe it's what you never actually finished feeling in the first place.